it's Maggie from Torii Consulting, and today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Today we think about the more than 1 billion people that are affected by issues with accessibility and inclusivity when designing a product or a service for the general public. Today I've spoken with some amazing and inspiration leaders from the likes of Intopia, Xero, Vision Australia, the ABC, and more to get their best tips and insights on how to make experiences accessible and friendly for everyone. What are your top tips for making a digital experience accessible?
I think the first thing is to make sure that all interactions are reachable and actionable however they're used. So some people on a computer will use a mouse, but not everybody uses a mouse for various reasons. And some people use a computer keyboard instead. For example, if somebody doesn't have the sufficient mobility or dexterity to use a mouse, which does require quite a bit of control, they might use a keyboard and tap around a website, for example, and action buttons or links using enter keys, space bars, that sort of thing. So we want to make sure that all of those controls are reachable and actionable however they're used. And when we think about phones, some people see the screen, they can tap on buttons and swipe and do and move around their app very easily that way, but not everybody does. People with limited dexterity, or perhaps people who are blind that enable screen readers, screen magnifiers, that sort of thing, may use the controls quite differently. So we want to make sure that all of the ways that people use devices are considered and are tested, and that's going to make it a really highly usable experience for everyone.
Of course, allow time and allow training and resources to spread throughout your team, and make sure that everyone in your team understands their own responsibilities.
For the product owner, it's all about prioritizing and understanding the importance of accessibility issues or experiences. So for them, having a think about how someone who might be using keyboard only can navigate through their experience, or somebody using a screen reader, or perhaps someone with a cognitive disability, and really thinking about whether the experiences that they've created are still accessible or able to be used by those groups of people. So that's really the product owner. When you go into the designer space, it's all about the actual design itself. So looking at your color contrast, looking at the way that you've structured the page, and thinking about whether that's still going to be usable for someone that's maybe zoomed in at 400%, or someone who has color blindness. So again, it's that sense checking that the experience that you're creating or designing is able to be accessed by everyone. Then as you go into the developer space, that becomes a little bit more technical, and it's all around having really great code, and that sort of checklist can be really useful. And in the tester side, we really look at testing using screen readers to make sure that what you're testing for, what you think is everyone, is actually being tested for everyone. So thinking about different assistive technologies and how they work with the product that's being created.
What motivates each person when it comes to accessibility? So for me, it is all about people. I love being or playing a very small part of actually improving accessibility and making something more usable for more people. But, you know, different motivators apply to different people. For a dev, it might actually be more due to quality of code. That might be their motivator. For designers, usually it is the person, but for a senior executive, it could be more business benefits. So find out those individual motivators for different people and use them for good. So that's one of my tips. My second one is embrace the shift left movement. So shift left is a concept, you might have come across it in like development, DevOps, that kind of thing, but it's really at its most fundamental, it's addressing something earlier on in the process. And so to take a really simple example, contrast, it's a designer thing. We should be addressing it at design. We should be making sure that we've got all of our lovely contrast, that, we've got a focus state for someone who's tabbing around in that meets our contrast requirements. All of that can be done at the design phase. the devs pick it up, they implement it, and hopefully we actually have no issues. So we don't, again, have to spend extra time repairing accessibility. Other responsibilities, a focus order. So the order in which we tab around a page. Often that someone might think that that should be left to developers, but it's really part of interaction design. It's part of how a keyboard user actually interacts and does something. So we can actually even shift that into sort of that design phase. So again, we're making those decisions at the right point in time and not spending extra time repairing it later on.
The use of color is really important for sighted users and people who can, can see color and convey color. Just from an aesthetics point of view and a design point of view, but also in terms of conveying information. So, obviously, different colors mean different things. So red might mean danger and green might mean go. And then people might use color to, colors used a lot then for things like, even if you're like booking a seat in the cinema, it might have the available seats in green and the non-available ones in gray, so that's great. So if you're sighted, you can really quickly see, oh, the green ones, I can click on those. But, if you're blind, for example, you can't see the colors. If you've got low vision, you may not be able to determine the colors. You may not have great ability to distinguish certain colors. And the same as if you're colorblind, you probably won't be able to do that. So there's a large group of people who cannot perceive colors or perceive them exactly as you might intend. So they might mix up the colors, such as if you're colorblind. So it's great to have those colors, but always supplement them with something else. So with text or with a tick for, for example, the seat is available, or with a shape or a pattern. So again, this is something that people wouldn't set out to do on purpose. They'd never set out to marginalize or make the experience more difficult. But like if we're giving training and we point it out to people and then we say, have a look on your website, they'll instantly start to find things on their website, for example, or a sample site that we might give them, whereby, people have used color as the sole means of conveying important information. So you can have it, but you just have to make sure that that information is conveyed without color as well.
Another one of the tips that I just can't stress enough is to, if you're creating content, it's digital content, and there are native ways of creating that content. If it's a website, we have HTML5. If we have mobile experiences, then Apple and Google provide really great componentry for creating these experiences. Use native code where possible, rather than trying to customize code if you're a developer, so that it, for example, looks like a button and works like a button if you tap on it. The reason for that is that the native code, the native componentry, comes packaged with most of the accessibility smarts so that you don't even need to worry about them that much. But as soon as you start creating custom controls, you need to think about the ways that they're going to be used, all of the scripting that goes into those, to make sure that they work the way that they're supposed to work in all the ways that they're used.
If you're using an authoring tool like a CMS, making sure that the authoring tool can produce accessible content, or if you're moving to a new authoring tool, making sure you've considered that. There's nothing worse than buying something and then realizing that it actually can't do the job whether you want it to or not. So that's one tip. Second tip is, if you are in a slightly larger organization with a design system, that's another awesome way to build accessibility into your branding and your components. If you get that right, you've sort of got halfway there. It doesn't mean that there's still not work to do, because how you put the components together, of course, also comes into making an accessible experience. But if you know that button or that form field or that table has been created in a way that's accessible, then you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel and repairing different things for accessibility. The last tip in that optimizing accessibility is using automated tools. Now, funnily enough, I'm often known as not a super big fan of automated tools, but that's because often people feel like they can use an automated tool, check for accessibility, and they're done. And in reality, a tool can only pick up anywhere between well, there's a bit of contention at the moment about how much you can pick up, but let's say 30 to 50%. But at the same time, that tool means that you're picking up things that you can do so with, in an automated way. So you don't want to ship something or commit some code without actually, covering off those sort of basic things that can be checked by a tool.
One that most people would be aware of would be providing alt text for images. So it's really just a description of an image or a graphic. Again, this is largely for people who have low vision, or benefits people who have low vision or don't have sight. So a screen reader, for example, will come through the website. It's not clever enough at the moment, although some websites, especially social media sites, can generate alternative text, but they're not always very good at it. So they'll say, this might be a tree, or this might be a seagull, but it could be anything else. So it's up to the user then, or the creator of the content, to generate a textual description of it, so that people who can't see the image get a text description of it that's announced to them by their software that they're using. You're also ticking a lot of boxes for for usability, SEO, mobile experiences. So it's not like you're doing a whole set of design guidelines and build guidelines that are specifically just for one user group. You're really benefiting a huge group of other people as well. So yeah, so a lot of these things will benefit a lot of people in different areas, not just solely in accessibility, which is really good.
What are some common misconceptions about accessibility?
One of the big ones is that it's hard.
This comes from accessibility not being considered from the outset. So if you've already created your app or your website experience and then you do an accessibility audit, of course, it's going to feel really overwhelming because there'll be lots of things that you won't have thought about. So that's when it starts to feel hard. But in fact, actually, if you consider inclusivity and accessibility from the outset, so whilst you move through your design, build and test, then actually achieving an inclusive or accessible site is much easier and not too hard at all.
Particularly if we think about creating good components and good digital experiences, use the web the way that it was meant to be made.
Is color contrast, making sure that text, icons, graphics actually stand out from the background that you place them on. Otherwise, if you don't do that, people who have low vision or people who are just out and about on their mobile phones and they've got glare on their screen may not be actually able to read the text on your website or app.
Another thing is it's expensive. That's another one that we hear about a lot, that oh no, look, we can't do accessibility now, it's too expensive. It's not. Once again, think about it early. Tell you what is expensive. Not thinking about accessibility, not factoring in accessibility. You need to understand that 20% of the population, thereabouts, approximately, have a disability. And a lot of people may have, beyond that, may have issues using that content. And if these people can't use your website, can't use your apps, then these are lost customers. These are lost users. And I tell you, that's expensive.
And you might think, how could that possibly be? Every fifth person I see doesn't have a disability, I think. Well, 70% of disabilities are hidden. You can't actually see it from the outside. So a lot more people than you think actually have a disability. And it means that essentially, if you build an inaccessible product, you're going to be turning away every fifth customer or fifth client.
The misconception that if my product meets WCAG, then it's accessible. So WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's the standard that most organizations will reference when it comes to accessibility. And don't get me wrong, I'm actually a big fan of WCAG. Some of my colleagues call me the walking WCAG Bible because I can quote it, I can tell you the nuances of it. But we often, I guess, equate accessibility with WCAG, where accessibility is really, can I do what I need to do using this product in the way that I need? WCAG is great. It has some great guidance. But I have seen sites or apps that have met or are close to meeting WCAG and yet are not usable. And there's a very big difference between what we call that technical accessibility, which is WCAG, and what is often called usable accessible, which is making sure that that thing works. I can do that thing. I don't really care whether it conforms with the standard or not. I just want to do that thing.
You can, be really low on the usability end, but very high on the WCAG conformance end. So usability is still important, making sure that it actually works for the users. That was the whole point. That's really, really important as well.
People with disabilities don't visit my site, or I've had no one complain. So, people aren't visiting the site that might have a disability. And I think that's also a little bit of a risk. Someone might come to your site, have a poor experience, and just go to the competitors, who might give them a better experience. They don't have to complain. They don't have to get in contact with you. And some people are, and I'm going to, I don't have a disability, so I'll be really, really clear about that. But I do know and have talked to some people that just get sick and tired of having to continually say, this doesn't work for me, contact an organisation. So it is really just about good user experience. And if we change our way of thinking into, this is just part of what we do, it's part of our quality product. It's no longer a additional add-on or something that we're like, oh my gosh, we have to do this. It's just something that we do in our everyday practice.
If you don't have the resources or the knowledge, then get training. Get someone in who does know from another organization and get them to walk you through how to do accessibility and then upskill and keep it up from there.
I work a lot with developers in my role, and necessarily front-end developers are very focused on screens and visuals. So they're all about, if they have heard of accessibility, which is not always the case, but if they have, they're very focused on vision and looking at low vision and screen reader support and those sorts of things. And sometimes I have to remind them to take a little step back and realize that accessibility is a much larger field. While the blind and low vision community are absolutely important and need, good quality websites, we also have to look at deaf and hard of hearing. We also have to look at cognitive impairments. We also have to look at the ways that people move and the way that people speak if they're using voice. So there's often a lot more to accessibility than people are first giving it credit.
The other misconception, and probably my least favorite one to get, is that it makes the design not pretty. And this one pretty much drives me wild because I just think it's so narrow-minded and I think it lacks creativity. And if you've got a really good designer, they're excited by the challenge of creating an experience that works for everyone. And in fact, they're a little bit embarrassed that their past experiences didn't work for everyone.
Another misconception is that accessibility only helps people with disabilities, and that's not true. Something I'd suggest you look at, Microsoft came out with a toolkit called Microsoft Inclusive. And they showed how for people who have a disability, getting it right and solving the problem for people with a disability, in fact, solves the problem for lots more people with temporary impairments. So, for example, somebody who has one arm, well, they have a permanent disability. And if we solve the problem for that person, then we also solve the problem for somebody with a broken arm or maybe a sprained wrist who may have trouble using a mouse too. And we also solve the problem for somebody with a situational impairment. The common example there is somebody holding a baby, holding a young child. They don't want to put the child down, but they do want to move around their computer keyboard with one arm.
Australia has an aging population. So at the moment, I think it's about 15% of the population is over 65. So that's quite a large percentage, you know, it's 2-3 million, whatever it might be, people. And of course, you don't just stop using the internet when you hit the age of 64 and, and clock off. And yeah, and like I said, that group is growing. By 2030, it's supposed to be up around 20% of the population. So it's always getting bigger. It doesn't include, or another group that benefits hugely from accessible content and design are people with dyslexia, but obviously that isn't deemed a disability, but that's up to 10% of the population. People with low literacy or literacy issues. It could be people who English mightn't be their first or native language, so they really benefit from accessible design as well. And obviously that's not counted in the initial 20% of long-term disability. And then even things like color blindness. So obviously color blindness isn't captured or deemed a disability, but it's 5% are colorblind. So like we were just mentioning before about supplementing color with text and things like that, that's a group that is affected. So it is, yeah, it's a really wide group of people. Yeah, and there is a kind of a misconception that it's a very small, narrow group that you're just fixing or making these changes for, but it's not. In fact, it's a really, large group. And even that, people even without a disability at all, so it could be just a situational thing. So for example, something like captions for video. So an accessibility requirement is that all video has to have captions. So if people were deaf, they're able to read the dialogue and the content that's going on. But similarly, people who can hear, but they may just be in a noisy environment or at the gym or, on the train and they want to listen to the news or whatever it is, captions are brilliant because it ticks all the boxes for them as well.
The problem is that people too often think about accessibility as something that we do simply to help people with disabilities. We've already seen it's not a small percentage. Getting it right means that you've simply got a better product that's more usable for everyone.
What are some examples of a really great accessible experience that you know of and can share with us?
The one organisation I did want to call out is Barclays Bank over in the UK. They do a really wonderful job of accessibility, not just throughout their products, but also in sharing resources that actually help people become more accessible. So I think they're always a good example to have a look at. One of my colleagues shared the Radio New Zealand site was particularly accessible for him. So you can go and take a look at that as well.
I was going to do a quick screen share of some websites that I think are particularly good. None of these are perfect. You can't look at these websites and expect these to be gospel in regards to what is accessible and what isn't. But I will show some generally good examples from different categories to see, just to give an example of what an accessible website can look like. One of them is a very exciting website, the ATO, Australian Taxation Office. I particularly like this website because they have a menu here which allows you to tab through it with the keyboard, and you'll be able to go through the top level navigation just like this. But there's actually a fairly big submenu here when you hover over the different options. And they thought about this because, sometimes a keyboard navigator may want to get to tax professionals and go into that section rather than tabbing through all of those links within the submenu. So what they've done is that they've actually made this accessible via arrow keys. So if you press down arrow, you're actually able to go into the submenu just like this. And I'm pressing the down arrow key here to actually go through into that section. And if I want to get into or the next section within the submenu, I can hit right arrow and it will actually take me to the next major section in that submenu. So they've really thought about keyboard accessibility on this website. So if you want a good example of that, check out the ATO. Next one I want to show is Shenton College. Shenton College actually won an award for its accessibility. And this is a very good example of a website that is quite visually stunning. There's a lot of colors being used, yet every step of the way, they've actually gone and make sure that their design is accessible, such as making sure that the colors here, the white on the blue and the green and orange, actually do stand out enough from the background to be easily readable for people low vision. The only thing I can say about this website as a bit of a downside is that you got this moving slider here, which periodically moves. I would have liked to have seen a pause button so that people won't be distracted by the moving object as they're reading through other content on the website. It's a requirement for sliders to have a pause button. So that's probably a little recommendation for Shenton College. And the other thing is the australia.gov.au, just a typical Australia website, is another really, really good example as well. Just to show you some things that they've done is they, of course, have features like skip to main content links, which will take you down to the main content and things like that. But there's also skip links before, big sections of the website. There's actually a hidden link here that reveals itself when navigating with the keyboard and allows me to skip past this carousel section if I want to. So it ends up, providing more navigation options for keyboard navigators, which is very, very cool, and becomes a bit more prominent when you get to down here and there's, quite a few links within this carousel. There's a skip link here to get past this section if the user doesn't want to dive into it. So those are probably my very quick top 3 picks of good accessible experiences. Oh, one more I'll show. The W3C website, the Web Accessibility Initiative, is also another good website to look out for. This not only provides a lot of resources for different job roles in regards to making your website accessible, so it's a good resource on its own for you to check out, but the people that made this are the same people that work on WCAG. And so they tend to use a lot of the best practices in regards to accessibility. So if you want to see more of a best practice, fully WCAG conformant website, I would check out this one. It's the W3C website and it's in the Web Accessibility Initiative section. And there's heaps of very good resources here for you if you want to learn more about accessibility.
I know that the experiences are becoming broader and broader as more and more companies and organizations get on board, realizing that accessibility helps a lot of people. If you look at all Apple products and Google products, if we think about companies that are really looking to engage with people broadly in a digital space, so we think about shopping experiences. So the supermarkets are putting a lot of time and effort into making their online shopping accessible. Why? Well, people with disability can really benefit from that. Rather than having to get to the shops, physically move around the aisles, if the online shopping experience is accessible, then they can do it all online. So there's huge interest there from the supermarkets. And I think if we have a look at their experiences, you'll find that they're pretty accessible, pretty good.
In particular, their online shopping website. So not only do they do a lot of technical compliance testing, but they also get a lot of feedback from real end users, which is critical. So I can go off and test a website against the guidelines, but I'm not, blind as such. I use a screen reader, but I'm not an end user. So I will test it and see, does it meet all the standards? But then we get in, some real end users who use the Coles website or screen reader users, and they'll give their feedback on how usable they find it. So it may technically be compliant, but if you can't use it, that's not really, if the end user can't use it successfully, that really isn't a goal.
Now think about your digital delivery teams. Do you have anyone in there that has lived experience with disabilities? Because if you do, that's truly co-design, and it's co-design in the most constructive way, because you've got that diversity within your workforce. So I really encourage all of us to challenge ourselves and think about how we, as people that don't live with disabilities, if you're a person that doesn't live with a disability, how are you actively ensuring that you've got co-design with people with lived experience of disability along all of your processes? During COVID, what was really reassuring for for Coles Group at that time was when they needed to switch on online for a specific group of customers, which were our vulnerable customers, so the elderly and people with disabilities. We were able to do that knowing that the site was already accessible because they'd spent so much time working on that over the previous years. So we didn't have that additional stress of, oh my goodness, where are we at for accessibility? We already knew. And I feel that that's something for other organisations to really take away and think about is, you know, it might not be that right now accessibility feels important, but absolutely in a time of crisis, accessibility is critical. So if you've already got it in there, then when that crisis hits, you can focus on other things, not just the basic accessibility of your site. And it's also quite a complex site. You know, it's an e-commerce site with lots and lots of images and lots of different journeys that people will be moving through as they use the site. So I think it gives you a great array of different things that are accessible. So you get to go through a registration or a sign-in process. You then need to go through a complex navigation menu to find product. You need to be able to drill down and find product information. And then there's the dreaded delivery slot selector or click and collect slot selector, which is quite a complex thing to make accessible, and they really work hard on that. And then of course you go through a payment gateway. So there's many different digital journeys there that they're constantly working on to ensure that they're accessible.
And not just Coles, Woolworths also spend a lot of time and effort and money in making their sites compliant. Most of the big banks have also. So the thing is, sometimes you may come across, because they have so many sites and legacy systems, you may come across some stuff that hasn't been fixed or it's quite old and going to be replaced. But in general, people like Commonwealth Bank, NAB, Westpac, they all put quite a lot of time and they take it quite seriously, along with other providers like Australia Post.
And anyone that really engages actively and broadly with people in digital spaces. But thinking about the ABC, every year we launch the Triple J Hottest 100, and that gets better and better in terms of accessibility every year. And similarly, the other voting experiences like the Classic 100. The ABC News app. ABC News is where Australians tend to go to find out what's going on in the world. And we put a lot of effort into making sure that the Triple J News app and web experiences are as accessible as we can make them. Similarly, on TV, you may have heard that we launched audio description in last year to help people who are blind or vision impaired see and understand what's going on visually on the screen. And the iView experience on connected devices, phones, tablets, computers, etc. Also really great accessible experiences that we pride ourselves at the ABC on.
Is about having clear content and clear pathways and less clutter. When we're assessing accessibility, we often get into the technicalities of what's in the code and how has the code been written and stuff like that. But often when we test with users, they're not getting stuck in the code, they're getting stuck with, what does this label mean? Or I don't understand this instruction. So that idea of clear content and readability is super important and sometimes overlooked. So that would be my key to an excellent accessible website.
Global Accessibility Awareness Day comes once a year. Accessibility impacts people on a daily basis. So take the lessons that we learned today, seek them out. There are lots of great talks and events and experiences. Check them out, learn from it, and share what you learn. Think about what you do every day, not once a year, and share it with people that you know and care about.
Try and inject accessibility into everything you do every day. If you want to challenge yourself, spend a morning without your mouse when you're in front of the keyboard, and just use your keyboard and see how challenging it can be. And you'll very, very quickly learn the difference between a good experience and a bad experience on the keyboard side. So yeah, happy GAAD.
Global Accessibility Awareness Day has been such a powerful day, I guess, in terms of increasing, awareness of accessibility. I remember when it started and there was just the very few, sort of events, and now there's, usually 40 odd, 50 odd events all around the world. And it brings us together. Whoever it is and whatever, whoever you is, whoever you are or whatever you're doing, there are so many of us who are contributing towards making a more inclusive world. And, to me, this is the day to, raise awareness of accessibility and, listen to those people who, often may not have an inclusive experience, but also come together as a community. Accessibility sometimes can be lonely and it can be hard. And so, coming together and supporting each other and, sharing our knowledge and sharing our information through a day like this and on any other day, I think is, it's been an incredible achievement, and, it's just so important.
Every month or so, might be every 2 months, Vision Australia runs a free webinar where we just talk about an accessibility topic for that month. Last time I presented, and I just showed everyone how to essentially do a very quick starter audit on their website to find accessibility issues. That's available on YouTube now. We often run free webinars on different topics, so you're very welcome to come along to them.